In a distant and almost forgotten corner of our vast country, a narrow country road meandered through a dense mixed forest. The locals had named this path the Foggy Trail due to the frequent mists that enveloped everything in a soft veil from early morning. The road sometimes climbed uphill and occasionally plunged suddenly into marshy lowlands, where damp moss squelched underfoot, and cold water droplets dripped like beads from the branches of tall pines. On this day, around noon, the weather was gray and damp, as if someone had hung endless storm clouds in the sky, ready to unleash a cold rain at any moment. A solitary man was walking along the foggy trail. Let's call him Ilya. He was not a native of the area, having come here temporarily on business, to check a small house he had inherited from a distant relative, whose existence he had only recently learned about. Ilya was middle-aged, with a touch of barely noticeable gray at his temples and a kind-hearted smile that he secretly considered his inherent talisman. On this day, he was walking the foggy trail on foot. His car had broken down the day before, and he decided to stroll to the store on the nearby street. Here, all streets were unlike the familiar city ones, narrow, uneven, surrounded by dense vegetation, with occasional crooked fences and sparse, lonely buildings. Evening was approaching, and Ilya wanted to manage to buy a few more groceries before the fast-falling autumn darkness enveloped the area. As he passed an unremarkable intersection located almost at the edge of the forest's fringe, his attention was suddenly caught by the sound of plaintive, drawn-out meowing. It would sometimes fade and then rise again, as if someone was calling for help but couldn't pinpoint their exact location. Ilya stopped, peered into the gray mist of the drizzling rain, and noticed something white near the edge of a gutter. Approaching closer, he saw a rather strange and sad scene. Amidst the autumn mud and wet grass at the bottom of the gutter, a snow-white cat was tied up. Once, its fur was likely shiningly clean, fluffy, and pleasing to the eye, but now it was tangled, clumped with dirt, soaked and spotted. The cat shivered from the cold and looked pitifully up at the stranger with large, despair-filled eyes. Nearby lay a rusty piece of wire, and around its neck was a short, sturdy chain that barely allowed it to move. Ilya felt his heart ache. It was obvious that the poor animal had been suffering for an unknown amount of time. It seemed the cat had tried to break free several times. Shredded clumps of earth and torn bushes were visible in the distant end of the gutter. But the chain offered no chances, restricting every movement. Ilya cautiously stepped onto the wet slope of the gutter, trying not to slip, and called out to the cat in a soft, soothing voice. "Hey, buddy, come on, don't be afraid. We'll figure something out soon," he said, trying to infuse his words with all his warmth. The cat stopped meowing and froze, as if it couldn't believe someone was genuinely trying to help. Its face was heavily soiled, and its eyes were slightly watery from the cold and dampness. It seemed to have lost hope, but deep in its gaze, a tiny spark still flickered, calling for rescue. Ilya took a few more steps and knelt beside the cat. It hissed in the first second, but quickly realized that the stranger posed no threat. The chain was smeared with mud and had rusted from constant dampness, and the lock seemed securely fixed. The man reached for the carabiner on the cat's neck to try to loosen the shackles, but it didn't budge. Finally, Ilya sighed in relief, finding another latch on the chain that he managed to lift using the key from his own keyring. Seconds later, the lock snapped open, and the chain clattered loudly onto the wet grass. "Well, little one, you can breathe easier now," he exclaimed. The cat seemed to disbelieve its fortune. It made a few uncertain movements, shook its wet fur, and meowed plaintively, as if saying, "Thank you." But then Ilya realized that the cat still couldn't free itself from the gutter. Its slope was steep. The viscous soil threatened to pull him down if he made a wrong step. Carefully, the man picked up the white, fluffy, wet rag in his arms and strained to climb back onto the road. At that moment, a stern voice sounded from the direction of the nearest house. "Hey, what are you doing? Who are you?" Ilya's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to encounter anyone local on such an unwelcoming evening. He turned around and saw a short, stocky man in a jacket with a stern, unkind face. His small, deeply set eyes seemed to bore through Ilya. "Me? Yes. I just saw the cat in the gutter and wanted to help it," Ilya explained, holding the snow-white poor thing close to his chest. "That's not your concern. The store owner tied the cat here, saying it's a stray and supposedly it catches mice." "It needs to stay like that," the stranger grumbled and suddenly smirked. "Though it's not your business, newcomer. Talk to anyone, and they'll say since this furry thing is hanging around here, let it be useful. Ilya frowned but tried not to show open dislike. Sorry, I just couldn't walk by. The poor creature is freezing, he said, catching his breath. And where's the owner of this store? The man nodded toward a wooden structure slightly off the road. That's his shop, a little further down the street, a brick building with a squeaky sign. Go inside, you'll see for yourself. Ilya only sighed. The cat weakly writhed in his arms. It seemed the animal was in shock from what was happening around it. Its fur was matted and dirty, and inside there seemed to be true horror. You could feel the cat's small heart pounding fiercely. Nevertheless, Ilya firmly decided he would not abandon this fluffy creature to its fate. He walked along the street, holding the cat close to prevent it from jumping out or falling into puddles. Meanwhile, the light rain had turned into a nasty, cold drizzle that threatened to seep under his collar. There was almost no one around. Only occasionally a shed door would creak or a dog would howl, but everything seemed damp, quiet, and somewhat gloomy. Finally, Ilya found the required building, a crooked little store made of red bricks. Above the entrance, a sign with the half-erased words, "Groceries and Household Goods," swayed unpleasantly. When he pushed the door, he immediately heard the melancholic jingle of a bell overhead, announcing a customer's arrival. Behind the counter stood a short man of indeterminate age, with a bald crown and thick reddish mustache. He squinted upon seeing Ilya and the white cat in his arms. "How can I help you?" The man grumbled through his teeth and frowned simultaneously. Ilya responded, trying not to reveal his anxiety in his voice. "I was told this is your cat. I want to know if I can, release it? It's in the gutter, completely frozen, dirty, and it's a living creature." The seller sighed loudly and began to explain how he had caught the cat and tied it by the gutter. He said, "It eats bread and sausage, drinks water, catches mice, and let it live there. It's none of my business." The store owner's voice carried indifference and a hint of malice. Ilya felt uneasy about such an attitude. "Maybe you could just give it to me?" "I'd take it home," Ilya suggested. "Ah, so easily?" The bald man squinted. "I fed it, kept it with me. You know how much money I spent on food? So I won't give it away for free, pay up." This was unexpected and unpleasant. Ilya only wanted to help the animal, nothing more. But it seemed the store owner had decided to make some extra money. The man sighed and tried to negotiate, but the seller was adamant. Either money or the cat remained by the gutter to continue catching mice. At some point, something clicked inside Ilya, and he realized, it's better to pay the money and take the animal, otherwise it's doomed. "All right," he said, handing the seller the sum. In his mind, he estimated it would cover a few good dinners in the city. "Just give me the cat." The bald man sighed, took the money, checked its authenticity, mumbled, "Fine, take it. I'm done covering its upkeep." He waved his hand as if to dismiss Ilya. "Get lost." Without saying another word, the man turned and left the store. Outside, the rain intensified, drops loudly tapping on the tin roof and trickling down the gutters. The cat was still trembling in his arms, and seeing its condition made Ilya's heart tighten. It became clear. First and foremost, he needed to take the animal to a veterinarian. Judging by the state of its fur and its anxious gaze, the cat clearly needed at least basic medical assistance, as well as washing and an examination for diseases. Ilya quickly realized that the nearest veterinary clinic was in a village about 3 kilometers down the foggy trail. 3 kilometers might seem short in the city, but here, in the countryside, under such weather, it could be quite a test. Fortunately, the man was not easily frightened. He had already undertaken longer hikes through swamps and forests. He pressed the cat closer to himself and started walking along the wet road, avoiding deep puddles and trying not to slip into roadside ditches. The rain was getting heavier. It seemed the wind was growing stronger, blowing gusts from the forest. The surrounding pines creaked loudly, and the forest's hum intensified, as if heralding an impending storm. The cat was breathing heavily, occasionally meowing weakly, and Ilya felt his heart painfully tighten with pity for the animal. "It's okay, buddy, just hold on a bit," he assured. "We'll reach the doctor soon, and they'll wash you, feed you something tasty. I promise, everything will be fine." It seemed the cat understood because from time to time it pressed itself against Ilya's chest, as if seeking warmth and protection. After a while, the road began to climb a small hill. The ascent was slippery, and Ilya almost fell twice but fortunately held on. As he was nearing the summit, he felt a premonition of some danger. The forest noise grew louder, and high above, a loud crack sounded, as if someone or something was breaking thick tree branches. The man stopped and looked ahead, trying to understand what was happening. At that very moment, lightning flashed directly overhead, followed by thunder, and the forest was illuminated by white light. A massive branch snapped off, crashing nearby Ilya and making his heart stop in horror. Seconds felt like an eternity, but the man didn't panic. He pressed the cat closer and jumped back a couple of steps to avoid the falling branch. The cat hissed in trying to escape his arms, but Ilya held on tighter. Letting go of the fluffy creature was mortally dangerous. Another moment, and the animal could be crushed or panic and flee into the forest, where something much worse surely awaited it. Breathing heavily, Ilya stared at the fallen branch. It was wet and heavy, and it had only a few seconds ago threatened to collapse right on their heads. What a weather, he thought, feeling adrenaline surge within him and his legs slightly trembling from the fear he had just experienced. What a walk, he muttered, squeezing the cat tighter and moving forward, trying not to linger on the dangerous section beneath the old trees. When they crossed the hill, soaked and exhausted, Ilya saw with relief that the road ahead was relatively flat, meaning he could pick up the pace. He understood that the remaining distance would have to be covered in worsening weather, but there was no other choice. The cat urgently needed help. They walked for a long time, perhaps 40 minutes or a bit more. Ilya couldn't say exactly, as each minute in such conditions felt endlessly prolonged. The rain continuously poured around them, and the wind tossed wet leaves and branches underfoot. It felt as though the wild nature was testing a person, whether he was determined enough to save a small defenseless creature. Finally, the first residential buildings of the village appeared in the distance. Ilya sighed with relief. He was walking along the muddy road and could already make out the dim lights in the windows of the houses. He saw a sign, "Veterinary Clinic," neatly painted on a wooden plank attached to a pole. Although the arrow pointed into a narrow alley, the main hope was that the clinic was nearby. The veterinary clinic building was small and slightly run down, but light was on inside, giving Ilya strength. He entered, and the familiar smell of medical supplies mixed with the scent of damp fur and something else, vaguely pharmaceutical, hit his nose. Behind the counter sat a young woman in a white coat, presumably the veterinarian herself. She looked at Ilya and his dirty white cat with wide-open eyes. "My goodness, what happened? You're all soaked. Come in quickly, sit down. Place the cat on the table, we'll take a look." She spoke sympathetically and briskly, inviting them into a small reception room. When Ilya placed his foundling on the table, the cat meowed plaintively, as if saying, "Don't hurt me, I've had enough." But the woman, introducing herself as Elena Petrovna, quickly composed herself and, putting on gloves, began examining the creature. She checked its ears, looked into its eyes, carefully felt its paws, wiped dirt with a napkin to examine the skin, then took out a stethoscope to listen to its breathing. No serious wounds, she delivered her verdict after a few minutes. But there's general hypothermia and dirt, just terrible. It needs to be washed, matted fur clipped, and we definitely need to run some tests. Yes, and we'll prescribe vitamins, she added, looking sympathetically at the cat. And you, young man, have a seat in the chair. Don't worry, we'll take care of everything. Ilya exhaled in relief and sank into a hard wooden chair in the corner. He was very glad he had reached medical assistance in time. Now, the main thing was to perform the necessary procedures. The cat seemed to be starting to trust new people. It only hissed a couple of times when Elena Petrovna tried to wash around its eyes and paws, but otherwise lay patiently, as if understanding that it was being saved. While the veterinarian was busy with the cat, Ilya noticed voices and rustling from behind the door, as if other patients with their pets were in the waiting room. But about 10 minutes later, Elena Petrovna called out, "Lyuda, help me please with the water procedures?" And a smiling assistant came out from the corridor. The women together moved the cat to an adjacent room equipped with a small table and a shower, and everything needed for bathing. Seeing that his presence was only hindering, Ilya stayed in the reception area. Another half hour passed. During this time, Ilya managed to dry off by the radiator, and the rain outside had stopped pouring, turning into a gentle drizzle. He even relaxed a bit and felt his legs ache from the long walk and anxiety. Finally, Elena Petrovna came out with the cat in her arms. It was completely unrecognizable. The fur was washed of dirt, matted clumps were neatly trimmed, leaving small bald spots in places, but overall, it looked much better. Moreover, the cat had developed a proud posture. It didn't press its ears as tightly, and its eyes sparkled a bit more cheerfully than before. "I would recommend leaving it here for at least a day," Elena Petrovna said, handing the cat to Ilya. "But I see it has already gotten used to you. If you want, we can arrange for it to stay overnight so it can rest, and you can come tomorrow. But perhaps you'd feel more comfortable taking it home right away? It's up to you." Ilya sighed. Of course, he wanted to do the best for this fluff ball. On one hand, leaving it at the vet for a day was a good idea. All the procedures, care, medications, everything under professional control. But on the other hand, the cat had suffered so much that it probably didn't want to part with the person who had shown it such warmth for the first time. "Maybe I'll take it home first, and if something's needed tomorrow, I'll bring it back," the man suggested. "You can check it again, right?" "Of course, you can come anytime," Elena Petrovna nodded. "Here's a guide on how to care for it in the next few days. And be sure to give it warm food, not just dry kibble. It spent a long time in the cold after all." Ilya thanked the veterinarian and the assistant, paid for all the procedures, and headed toward the exit. The cat, now covered in a warm blanket, Elena Petrovna had found a small blanket to keep it from getting cold, looked at its rescuer almost reverently. It seemed that in its gaze was endless gratitude and a slight fatigue. The road home and the first days in a new life. When Ilya left the clinic, it was already dark. A light haze still covered the street, and streetlights timidly illuminated the puddles on the road. The rain had almost stopped, with only occasional heavy drops falling from the branches, and the wind played with gusts, tossing the remaining leaves under the feet of passers-by. Ilya now needed to return to his car, which was left in a small roadside workshop behind that very hill. He understood that he would have to walk again along the dark forest trail, but now he had the cat with him. Though more or less dry and wrapped, it was still exhausted. To his relief, he managed to catch a random ride. A neighbor's UAZ with an elderly driver was passing by, who turned out to be quite kind-hearted. Ilya climbed into the back seat, carefully holding the cat close to himself. The old driver, upon hearing the situation, sighed about the harsh rules in the area where tying a cat by the gutter is a piece of cake, as long as it catches mice, and shook his head, saying how far people had come. "Thank you for not passing by. Animals are defenseless after all," he added quietly as he drove onto the country road. Along the way, they crossed the very intersection where the cat had been found. Ilya looked toward the gutter. It was now dark there, and the wind and rain made it even more ominous. He felt uneasy, thinking about what would have happened if he had decided to walk by and not intervene. Inside him surged a wave of horror, realizing how many such unfortunate animals are left without help, unwanted by anyone. But he shook his head, trying to push away the sad thoughts, and held the snow-white rescued little one closer. Finally, they reached the roadside workshop where Ilya's car stood. The mechanics hadn't managed to fix the breakdown during the day, but promised everything would be ready by morning. There was nothing to do. He had to find temporary lodging in the nearby village. And there, by a fortunate coincidence, the same kind driver knew someone who rented a room in a small guest house. Ilya rented this room to spend the night with the cat and finally allowed himself to catch his breath. In the house, the cat initially sniffed cautiously around the surroundings, then, seemingly feeling the warmth of the room, sighed in relief and settled on the mat near the radiator. Ilya found canned cat food, a bowl, and a packet of milk on the way from the store. Upon seeing the food, the cat perked up immediately. It ate so greedily as if it had never seen proper food before. All the while, Ilya watched it with genuine tenderness and sympathy. "Well, buddy, now you're safe. Tomorrow we'll go to my home. You'll have your own warm bed there, Missy," he said, petting the cat's head. The cat responded with a quiet, barely audible purr and closed its eyes, clearly tired after the day's ordeals. The night passed peacefully. Ilya dozed off on the couch, and the cat, seemingly sleeping soundly without its hind legs, rested quietly and warmly. In the morning, when the man woke up, he saw the fluffy white ball already sitting by the door, looking at him as if saying, "What if you disappear again?" Ilya smiled, patted the cat's ear, and went to wash up. After having breakfast himself and feeding his new pet, Ilya went back to the mechanics, and to his delight, the car was already running. Packing his things and settling the room, he thanked everyone for their help and drove toward his home, which stood on the outskirts of the village. surrounded by dense coniferous forests. Here, among tall pines and spruces, lay a modest inheritance passed down to Ilya from his great-grandfather. The house was old, but it had an electric heater and a simple stove. Ilya used to visit here on sudden trips, and now he wanted to stay for some time while deciding what to do next. He hoped the cat would like it here. Quiet nature, clean air, fresh water from the nearby well, and most importantly, no evil owners, chains, or drafty gutters. As soon as they entered the house, the cat cautiously stamped in place, looking around. Noticing a clean, neat rug by the bed, it happily approached and, as if checking, pawed at it. Then it sat and stared intently at Ilya. Meow, it sounded softly, but somehow especially trustingly. I understand, buddy, the man smirked. It's clean here and no smelly gutters. You'll like it here. The cat apparently liked Ilya's tone and the place itself. It rubbed against the owner's leg as if saying, "Thank you for bringing me here." Thus began the new life of this white fluffball. At first, Ilya carefully monitored its health, gave vitamins as prescribed by the veterinarian, and bought special soft shampoo to wash its fur more thoroughly. The cat, though sometimes grumpy during bathing, became quite affectionate after being washed, wrapped in warm towels, and given a portion of food. A week flew by unnoticed. The cat had fully settled in, only occasionally flinching when hearing loud sounds outside, seemingly remembering the recent fears. Ilya almost didn't leave the house during these days. The weather was chilly, and he himself worked remotely. However, he took breaks to play with the cat or simply pet it. In moments of such closeness, Ilya felt warmth and quiet joy in his soul. After all, saving a living being gives life a special meaning. Unexpected complications and stalking with danger. It seemed the story was already heading towards a happy ending. The cat was now safe, well-fed, and cared for, and the malicious store owner was left as a memory. But the wild nature of the surrounding area sometimes surprises. About 2 weeks after rescuing the cat, when the weather finally became a bit clearer, Ilya decided to walk to that very intersection and its vicinity once more to see if any similar hostages remained from irresponsible people. Additionally, he intended to buy some supplies, as the old store in his village was barely operational, and the selection in the village with the vet clinic was broader. In the morning, when Ilya was about to leave, the cat, as if sensing something, wouldn't leave the entrance door. It looked at the owner with big eyes that pleaded, "Don't leave me for long, I'm scared." But Ilya encouraged it by gently stroking its head. "It's okay, little one. I'm not far. I'll be back soon. You know I won't abandon you." He said it and walked away. To reach the village faster by car would have been possible, but this time Ilya decided to walk on foot to get some fresh air and admire the autumn forest, which still held a red-yellow palette. The first part of the journey was uneventful. The forest looked quite welcoming. Sunbeams filtered through the canopy, and although the ground was wet from the recent rains, the weather was still beautiful compared to the past weeks. However, when he emerged at the edge of a clearing he needed to cross to reach the main road, he suddenly heard a distant engine rumble. A car was driving down the country lane. Ilya wouldn't have paid attention if he hadn't noticed two men ahead, dressed in camouflage jackets. They stood by their beaten Neva and were tensely conversing about something. "Well, I'm telling you for sure they saw them here," one of the men, tall and stocky with a weather-beaten face, exclaimed loudly. "The beast is large, the pelt is expensive. Heard how much they're getting for it at the market?" Ilya's heart stopped. He realized they were probably talking about poaching. These forests were home to foxes, martens, sometimes lynxes appeared, and unfortunately, there were people who hunted them for profit. "Yeah, I understand everything, but we need to act carefully," the other man, shorter in stature, added. "The locals are sharp. A couple of weeks ago, we already caught one of those hunters for poaching. Fined him, but he deserved it. But catching this little beast secured money for the whole winter." Ilya felt a surge of indignation inside him. Trapping wild animals in such a cruel manner was blatant criminality. He tried to move silently to avoid catching their attention, but apparently, the bushes underfoot rustled treacherously, and one of the poachers quickly lifted his head. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted, making it clear that these types couldn't tolerate objections. Ilya froze, trying not to panic. Damn, he was in deep. If they realized he had overheard their conversation, a conflict might arise. He thought it would be quiet to back away, but the shorter one had already moved toward him. "Who's here? Come out!" Realizing that hiding was impossible, Ilya cautiously stepped out of the bushes, raised his hands to show he was unarmed. "Good afternoon. I'm just passing by," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Why are you sneaking around?" the stocky one asked sternly. "I'm not sneaking. I just heard your voice, thought maybe you need help," Ilya tried to lie. The men exchanged distrustful glances. One of them, the shorter one, immediately raised his voice. "Look, someone's lurking here, eavesdropping. Didn't you hear anything?" No, Ilya shook his head. "I'm actually heading toward the village." But everything in his demeanor suggested otherwise. The poachers realized he had likely heard something. A tense silence hung for a moment, and then the stocky one unexpectedly smirked. "All right, get out of here. If you're going to the village, go straight ahead. Don't you dare tell anyone anything, or else, troubles might happen." Troubles? That sounded like a clear threat. Ilya swallowed hard, looked into their angry eyes, and nodded, trying to maintain a calm appearance. He turned and walked across the clearing, feeling his heart pound. He understood that these people were engaged in illegal activities, and things could end much worse. He walked very quickly, almost running, and only caught his breath once he was at a reasonable distance. He knew reporting the incident to the police would be difficult. Here, reports often get lost, and one would need to provide evidence. But Ilya firmly decided, if he saw something similar again or heard that they were harming animals, he would definitely report it to the authorities. After walking a few more kilometers, he finally reached familiar places near the ill-fated store where he had once found the white cat. Inside, the memory of the trembling cat in the gutter struck him again. But the store was now locked, windows dark, and the owner seemed to have gone somewhere. Good, Ilya thought. Fewer reasons for conflicts. He bought groceries at another shop he was originally heading to and then decided to return home without lingering. Along the way, he thought, what if these poachers are nearby? And if he gets in their way, would they want to take revenge? Just the thought of it caused a wave of anxiety. But he still had to go, and Ilya walked, trying to stay on open sections of the roads to be visible to other residents in case of anything. Climax. A brave step to save. On the return journey, the weather suddenly worsened. Heavy clouds rose on the horizon, and a cold wind whistled piercingly through the bare branches of trees. It began to snow with the rain, and Ilya had to pull up his hood and tuck his hands deeper into his pockets. It became unbearably chilly to walk, his face burning from the sharp icy drops hitting it. As he walked through a small birch grove about 1.5 kilometers from his home, he suddenly heard a prolonged dog howl nearby, followed by a strange sharp sound, like the crack of a gunshot. Ilya felt a shiver run through him. He realized someone was hunting in the forest, and he immediately thought of those very poachers. Maybe it was them, or people like them. Inside, two feelings battled: fear and indignation. What if some animal got hurt? What if it's injured and left to die? He thought, his heart freezing in horror. Ilya moved toward the noise. Yes, it was dangerous. He understood that he risked encountering armed people, but he couldn't just walk by and pretend he didn't hear anything. It sounded as if something was moaning or whimpering in the bushes. The closer he approached, the faster his heart pounded. Suddenly, through the gusts of wind, he heard plaintive growling and screeching. Carefully parting the bushes, Ilya froze in amazement. A large lynx was clinging to the tree trunk with its claws. It was injured. The blood was visible on its hind paw. Nearby, a dog was struggling, seemingly trained on game, barking and growling fiercely, trying to corner the lynx, preventing it from escaping. The shot Ilya had heard had apparently wounded it. A little to the side stood two men, and who would have thought? The very poachers in camouflage. One of them was reloading his rifle, the other loudly ordering the dog not to let the lynx get into the dense underbrush. Ilya watched this gruesome spectacle in horror and indignation. His emotions boiled over. How could this happen? And then the man noticed that the poachers were preparing for another shot. If they hit the lynx, it would be the animal's end right there. Something needs to be done, flashed through Ilya's mind. Yes, it was a crazy, desperate move, but he couldn't do otherwise. He took a deep breath and, not giving himself time to hesitate, shouted, "Stop!" and rushed out into the clearing. His heart raced as if it was about to leap out of his chest. The lynx, seeing the man, became even more frightened and pressed harder against the tree. The dog yelped, and the poachers turned sharply. "You?" the stocky one sneered maliciously. "You're hanging around here again." "Leave her alone," Ilya shouted, feeling everything inside him tremble. "What's it to you?" the second one yelled. "See, the beast is wounded. We've almost caught it. Get out of here while you're still safe." But Ilya didn't move. He understood. If nothing was done, the lynx would die right there, just a few steps away. The dog continued to bark, and the animal was cornered, injured, with no strength to fight, while the poachers held rifles in their hands. "This is illegal," Ilya exclaimed, looking into their eyes. "You'll be held accountable. I'll report you to the police." The poachers glanced at each other. The stocky one, frowning, raised his weapon. "You won't report anything. You want bullets?" At that moment, a wave of horror crashed over Ilya so intensely that he felt like running, but he stood his ground, feeling his legs tremble with fear. It seemed time had slowed down. The snow mixed with rain lashed his face. Everything around was like in a gray fog, but he didn't back down. "I won't leave. You won't dare shoot someone in broad daylight," he said, trying to keep his voice firm, though his insides trembled. "Anyway, you'll expose yourselves. There are plenty of hunting towers, cameras here." He lied about the cameras. What cameras were there in the wilderness? But he hoped they would be confused. And apparently that's what happened. The poachers indeed exchanged uneasy glances. Maybe they had necessary connections, but killing a person was unlikely. They were dealing with a whole different level of crime. "Say it one more time, I'll shoot!" the stocky one yelled, but his voice didn't sound as confident as before. Ilya felt the climax approaching. Just another second, and something would happen. Either they would try to grab him, or he would fight back himself. But how could he threaten them? Run? Then they'd shoot the lynx without hesitation. Engage in hand-to-hand combat against two armed men? Madness. But then an unexpected twist occurred. From behind a tree, a loud voice called out, "Hey, stop right there!" And two other men in ranger uniforms dashed out. Apparently, they were members of the hunting oversight or forest rangers patrolling the area. The poachers turned pale. One cursed, the other grabbed the dog by its collar and hissed, "We're leaving!" And they rushed to their Neva. The two men in uniforms chased after them. Chaos ensued. The dog yelped, pulling the poacher toward the car. Snow mixed with rain lashed, and everything turned into a frenzy in seconds. Ilya, seizing the moment, rushed to the lynx. The creature growled fiercely, showing its claws, but had no strength to resist. It was clear the lynx was wounded and exhausted, and its paws were stained with bloody goo mixed with snow. The man quickly removed his scarf and cautiously approached, trying not to scare the predator further. But the lynx snarled wildly. It was terrifying for both itself and Ilya, but he spoke in a soft voice. "Calm down, I won't harm you. I want to help." He wrapped its paw with the scarf to stop the bleeding. Whether from exhaustion or the cold weather, the lynx didn't resist. Somewhere behind, sounds of struggle and shouts were heard. Then a police siren blared. Someone had apparently called for help. Ilya didn't know how it would end for the poachers, but the main thing now was to save the animal. While the lynx was breathing heavily by the tree, he looked around and saw one of the rangers returning. "Off the road! This is a dangerous animal!" the ranger shouted. "I know, but she's injured. She needs a vet," Ilya explained. "I've already bandaged her paw." The ranger frowned disapprovingly, but assessing the situation said, "All right, we'll call specialists from the zoo or the Nature Conservation Center. We need to immobilize her and move her to a safe place. You'd better step aside." Ilya realized that resisting was pointless and that the ranger was right. The lynx was a wild animal and could be dangerous, especially in pain. He took a step back, giving way to the professionals. The lynx twisted a couple of times, hissed, but then its strength was gone, and it collapsed onto its side, breathing heavily. The situation gradually came under control. The two in uniform attended to the animal, and the poachers, judging by the shouts and commands heard from somewhere further away, were already being surrounded by arriving police officers. Ilya finally released his tension and felt the adrenaline-induced tremor envelop his entire body. He slowly stepped back and sat on the fallen tree, bowing his head. Images flashed before his eyes. The poachers, the gunshot, the injured lynx, the dog charging at the predator, and how he had rushed in head first. "I'm completely insane," he thought. But inside, he felt pride for not having chickened out. About 15 minutes later, a car adorned with Nature Conservation Service insignia arrived at the scene. The specialists, clad in protective gear, carefully placed the lynx on a stretcher, giving her a sedative injection to prevent her from suffering in pain. They briefly explained to Ilya that they would take the animal to the Wild Animal Rehabilitation Center, where she would be treated and, if all went well, eventually released back into her natural habitat. "Thank you," one of the specialists said to Ilya. Not everyone would risk standing up against poachers. The man merely nodded silently, feeling his heart race. For him, it was a genuine emotional explosion, fear, relief, and joy that the lynx was alive. Resolution, freedom, realization, and unexpected gratitude. The poachers were detained. It turned out they had been sought for a long time, and with Ilya's intervention, he inadvertently helped the police and rangers catch the criminals red-handed. The animal was saved, although the wound was serious, but the veterinarians assured that the lynx had a chance for complete recovery. Ilya gave his statement, was thanked for his assistance, and all these troubles took up the rest of the day, so he returned home that night, exhausted, soaking wet, and hungry. The door to his home opened, and on the doorstep greeted him his white cat, who immediately began rubbing against his legs, welcoming its owner. The man smiled, feeling a wave of coziness and warmth wash over him after everything he had endured. The cat quietly purred, as if saying, "Finally, I was worried when you'd return." And Ilya felt something akin to gratitude from nature itself, for he had saved this small life, and today intervened in a terrible situation with the lynx. The following days passed. News of the detained poachers spread throughout the area, and the forest rangers called Ilya several times, informing him of updates. The operation had been successful, the criminals faced serious punishment, and the injured lynx was gradually recovering. Listening to these reports, Ilya felt a quiet pride and realized an important truth. Nature must be preserved, and each of us can contribute to its protection. But the story didn't end there. About 3 weeks later, the weather had become more wintry. Nights brought light frost, and mornings were covered with hoarfrost on tree branches. Ilya was sitting at home, drinking hot tea, while the cat lounged by the radiator, purring its feline song. Suddenly, the phone rang. It was an employee from the Wild Animal Rehabilitation Center. "Hello, Ilya. Do you remember the lynx you helped save?" a voice on the other end of the line asked. "We have good news. She's strong enough now. Her wound is healing. We plan to release her back into her native habitat in a week or two. We wanted to invite you to be present at her release if you'd like." Ilya felt his heart tighten with joy. Of course, he wanted to see it with his own eyes. And so, a few days later, on a clear, quiet afternoon, a small group gathered at the edge of that very forest. A couple of rangers, the vet, center staff, and Ilya. They brought the very lynx in a cage. The animal looked almost healthy, its fur shiny, eyes burning with a wild, free-spirited fire. The ranger slowly opened the cage door, and the lynx, at first timidly, then increasingly confidently, stepped outside. It took a couple of unsteady steps, looked around at the people, and suddenly dashed into the depths of the forest, leaped powerfully, stretching all its muscles, and vanished behind the trees. "Free," Ilya whispered. At that moment, something inside him flipped. He sharply felt the entire beauty and fragility of nature, how easily it can be destroyed and how important it is to protect it. As they were about to leave, the veterinarian quietly said, "Sometimes it seems that animals sense who's on their side. Maybe someday she'll appear again too." He smiled. "Thank you. And who knows, perhaps there was some truth to it." Nature sometimes responds to people's good deeds in the most unexpected ways. That evening, returning home, Ilya sat in his living room, and his white cat, now comfortably settled on his lap, purred and looked directly into his eyes. Then Ilya noticed something unusual. Previously, the cat rarely looked so long and attentively, but now its gaze was calm, almost human, with a subtle smile in its cat eyes. The man laughed quietly. "Do you feel it? That today we saved your kindred spirit? Though wild, it's still a big cat." The cat perked up its ears, then purred and nudged its face against Ilya's palm. It was like that very unexpected gratitude. "Thank you for rescuing me, for your generosity towards any living creature." Dear viewers, this is how one incident saving a dirty, trembling cat by the gutter, turned into a whole chain of events that led to the realization of how important it is to treat nature gently and to be more attentive to its inhabitants. Sometimes a brave step or just a compassionate act can change someone's life. Whether it's the life of a small domestic cat that found itself in trouble or the life of an injured lynx cornered by poachers. If you enjoyed this story, please share it with friends and acquaintances, give it a like, and leave your comment. Share similar cases, for it is these examples that inspire us to cherish nature and help those in need of protection. There are far more good people around than it seems, and each of us can contribute to preserving the wonderful animal world that surrounds us. Take care of nature, friends, and until next time.